My name is Federica Genovese. I'm a political scientist. I specialize in the politics of crisis and specifically climate change. Welcome to my exp. Climate change needs to be addressed by international politics because it is an international issue to begin with. It is true that not all countries have been responsible to the problem. The early industrializers have produced more emissions and have contributed to climate change earlier in the process. But at this point, the entire world will be suffering from climate change. And in fact, fossil fuel investments and carbon emissions are also increasingly coming from parts of the world that historically have not been responsible at this point in time. So the only way to be dealing with the issue effectively and credibly requires some type of international agreement, some level of international cooperation. There is no way in which only one country can solve the problem. This cannot be a unilateral political issue that is addressed only by, say, the United States, only by the European Union, or for that matter, only by China. The so-called Conference of the Parties belongs to the United Nations framework of doing climate politics. It's called the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. The first COP happened in 1995. The UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention, was established in 1992. And the reason it is a process that is set up within the United Nations is because the United Nations is the best type of institution that we have as a collective to give every country the possibility to speak about a problem that is quintessentially global. International frameworks like the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, therefore, are fundamental to make sure that every once in a while, all the relevant actors, lawyers, economists, investors, politicians are in the same room to discuss the same issues at the same time. One thing that is critical about the process of climate negotiations, the annual meetings at the UN on climate change, is that there are moments in which the importance of climate change really takes all the oxygen in the newsroom, that takes all the oxygen in prime ministers, heads of governments that have to fly into those meetings and to give speeches and meet with other heads of government. So once a year for 1, if not 2 weeks, these meetings are usually 2 weeks, but the high level segments is usually only 1 week, a lot of attention is spent on these meetings. And the reason we need these meetings and we need to care about these meetings is because they increase what I call the domestic salience of climate change. It lets people sort of think about what their situation is when it comes to climate change. It forces governments, institutions, but also citizens and voters to really confront their positionality towards climate change and also towards other countries that are suffering more than them, possibly climate change, or other countries that are possibly more responsible to the emissions that contribute to climate change. So this is what I mean by the domestic salience increasing during these meetings. It's also what happens at home from the people that are consuming the news about these meetings. It's also about the type of mobilization and activation that happens at home among the audiences that are becoming more aware about these meetings and decisions made there. International climate politics really picked up in the 1990s. And let's remember the 1990s were the time when the Cold War had just ended. So all of a sudden, we felt like we were in a unipolar globe, for the most part dominated by the United States. It was made very clear that most of the responsibility for the emissions that contribute to climate change came from the global north, or what were called the Annex I countries, the industrialized, rich states, while the developing world, what we now call the global south, needed to do something about climate change, but was not meant to be deemed responsible for the issue. That frame made sense back then, but of course the world evolved. A lot of emerging economies in the global south actually have reached level of development and to some extent concentrated wealth that is very much comparable to rich industrialized states. So we still use the frames of the 1990s, of the early days of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, to speak about international climate politics. So I think that a better way to think about who really holds the power of deciding outcomes at the climate negotiations embedded in the Conference of the Parties is to be thinking about strong states. Those are states that simply have the capacity of doing climate politics more credibly. Historically, they have been rich industrialized countries. They don't need to be. This is a more fluid definition precisely because thinking only about Europe, Japan, Australia, and North America as the parties that will always have to do more on climate change is not historically updated. Vice versa, I think when thinking about the states that have a harder time making their case for their policies or their preferred policies at climate negotiations, we need to think about weak states. Those are the ones that have lower capacity, lower credibility to really push for climate change. And again, historically, these have been global south countries, and they still are for the most part. They are the least developed countries of, the continent of Africa, small islands. Weak states can still be very much politically pivoting because their weakness can be weaponized. Historically, it has happened especially with the group of small islands that have been very influential in not all, but some items discussed at COP negotiations. And I think that as more states also in the geographic global north become weak, because they will become more overwhelmed by climate change, because of austerity, because of, the inflation crisis, they may end up really taking the side of those historically vulnerable countries that have made a point at climate negotiations. We cannot abandon international climate processes. Some skeptical voices, even among colleagues of mine, have been very frustrated by the slow pace and the gradual marginal productivity of some of these COP meetings. I'm of the belief that we need those processes, and I don't want to live in a world that does not have the UNFCCC or the COP meetings. That said, I totally take the point that there is ample space for reforms. And if I were to advise the architects of the new legal system that may be, replacing maybe the Paris Agreement in the future, I believe that on an institutional, sort of more legalistic side of things, one of the main problems of policymaking at the COP is that is based on unanimity vote. Essentially, there needs to be consensus across all the countries around the world that sit at the UN for agreements, bold agreements, to be decided upon. And unanimity is a very, very difficult electoral rule to have, especially when the world is fragmented and when society is polarized. So a way to move to supermajority rules or to get some types of agreements to be done without unanimity would be, I think, a welcome formal change in the way we do international climate politics. There's also a more practical sort of suggestion that I would bring to the fore, which is that we need to really make sure that this continues being a process that is inclusive.